Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation, how to develop a RISE with SAP Roadmap for S/4HANA on Google Cloud. We're going to cover really three things today. We're going to talk about S/4HANA, of course. We're going to talk about RISE with SAP, and we talk about the GCP platform. My name is Bernd Baier. You see a picture of me on the bottom right side. I'm with CNT Management Consulting, and I'm joined by Andy.
And I'm Andy Wiesner. I'm a solution architect here at Managecore.
Great. Looking forward working with everybody. If we can go to the next slide, Andy. So again, I mentioned earlier, we are covering three topics, and this is really the message for today's presentation, how we put those three topics together. If you look at SAP, we always had three different silos. We had the infrastructure, we had the operations, and we had the functional consulting. In my personal history, I started in infrastructure. I've been working many years in SAP basis, and I'm now for a while in the SAP business process area on the functional side. So we want to talk about RISE with SAP, which impacts a lot of the operations, but also a lot of the functional, and also how you look at your SAP systems, and the holistic view on the operations, and then finally the infrastructure. From an agenda perspective, Andy, you're going too fast.
Sorry about that.
From the agenda, we want to talk about the basics of S/4HANA conversions. What is RISE for SAP? There are a lot of definitions. Everybody thinks it's something different, including SAP, but it's something very specific and something with a bit of a gray area at the same time. I'm going to specifically talk about business process transformation into S4 and into RISE with SAP. Andy's going to talk about technical migrations and operations and the Google Cloud for RISE with SAP. And then we talk about the assessment approach, because at the end, we need to build a roadmap. Where are we? Where do we need to go to get to S/4HANA on RISE? Because that's where we're all going to wind up in a couple of years, the latest. At the end, we have a summary and also time for question and answers. A brief introduction of who we are. I'm with CNT. We are a functional ERP consulting firm. But before I introduce us in more detail, I'm going to let Andy introduce Managecore.
Sounds great. Thank you, Bernd. And so Managecore, we're an IT and SAP technical consulting firm. We specialize in SAP basis. Managecore is really grown up in the SAP ecosystem. But then we also are a partner with Google Cloud, along with the other hyperscalers. And so one of our major focuses now is helping customers to transform, upgrade, and migrate their systems into the cloud. And specifically, today we'll be talking about moving systems into the RISE with SAP. And so Managecore's complete suite of services include our migration services, our cloud managed services. We do provide IT managed services for all of your non-SAP workloads. And then, of course, all of our basis managed services. All of these are backed by our Watchdog monitoring platform, which helps us to monitor customer systems, to automate standard processes, and ultimately to make good on our promise of being one of the most transparent managed services providers around. That is something that's very big and core to our being as an organization. We call it our T's and C's, which are trust, transparency, communication, and collaboration. And that really helps us to be honest and accountable with all of our customers. One of the major tenets of Managecore is the fact that we deliver all of our services with senior level consultants who have at least 10 years of experience in the SAP and the infrastructure worlds. And so all of this helps us to deliver our services and ultimately to help our customers to migrate to the cloud with 100% success. So now, Bernd, I'll turn it to you to discuss a little bit more about CNT.
Great. And CNT, we have our roots in Europe, like a lot of the SAP functional consulting firms. We have 300 consultants worldwide. We have 22 years of history in SAP, and we worked on more than 60 S/4HANA projects to date. The unique thing about CNT is that we are covering the complete SAP spectrum from a functional perspective, and a lot of the smaller or mid-sized consulting firms typically only do either manufacturing or retail or a specific area in SAP, but we cover the complete SAP stack, which makes us unique. On the next slide, we see our functional competencies, and we are an SAP only consulting firm. And with that, we cover and we mirror the SAP portfolio. We do SAP Ariba, we do IBP, we do warehouse management, CX, analytics, enterprise asset management. We have a lot of focus on manufacturing, not exclusive, but we are heavy on manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, and the pharmaceutical industry and life sciences. At the bottom, we do the business process consulting, or the underlying foundation, and more of that is going to be the SAP Business Technology Platform. So let's dive more into the details of the basics of S/4HANA and the business transformation. And Andy, my presentation just disappeared. Thank you.
Perfect.
You go to the next slide. Yes, next slide, please. So the first thing is, and we all know S/4HANA, I don't think I need to sell S/4HANA, but I want to reiterate how important of a change S/4HANA is and how different the new world of S/4HANA is to the old world of SAP ECC. It is a fundamental new step, and the world with S/4HANA is significantly different than the world with ECC. And even companies who have ECC to migrate to S/4HANA, many times they are still kind of trying to operate it the same way, but there's so many opportunities with S/4HANA, and please don't skip this or push it out too much. There is, you need to take advantage of the S/4HANA infrastructure, because this is one of the SAP slides I really like, because it's so many things you can take advantage of. Next slide. We have again the opportunities and the challenges, and really the opportunities are many. And I put this in this presentation today because many customers still have issues arguing the business case for S/4HANA in their organization, and we can't just rely on speed. It's going to be faster and it's going to be better. We have to be more specific. So there are specific business values of moving to S/4HANA. This is not the topic for today, but just keep it in mind. The challenges, they are 100% transitional. I don't see any fundamental challenges with S/4HANA other than things are different and there is change involved. But the whole challenge section, that is only in the transition getting from ECC to HANA. And since we have been running on ECC, many companies for 15, 20 years build things around it. There is a challenge and we need to overcome that. But that's some of the roadmap building process we're also helping with. On the next slide, this is a slide I found from SAP and I adjusted. It really shows the best overview between the Brownfield and Greenfield transformation. We call Brownfield conversion because we basically reuse the existing processes, reuse the existing system. So you see this on the very left, and on the very right, you see the Greenfield transformation where we basically start an SAP system from scratch. Now, when you ask the business, they always say, let's do Greenfield, let's start everything from scratch. But the IT, they usually like to keep what they have, and they both have a point. We need to do new things, but at the same time, we can't just skip everything we did in the last 10, 15 years. There are a lot of shades in between Brownfield and Greenfield. One is the empty shell conversion, one is the mix and match conversion. And these are also conversion paths as you go into S/4HANA on RISE with SAP. And talking of RISE with SAP, and I think that came out already, there are two steps. One is S/4HANA, if you're still on ECC, and the other one is moving to RISE, which can be all combined in one. But we're going to talk about that later. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier, S/4HANA is not just a new release, it's a significantly new milestone in how we operate SAP. And what SAP does is, with RISE, they include some of the new features by default. They're mostly starter packs, but they want everybody to start using tools, solutions around the S/4HANA core. So one is the business network, is the basically it's some of the Ariba functionality that is accessible to S/4HANA is the connection to the Ariba network. It helps, and it's a great way to start with Ariba, thinking of Ariba if you don't already have it. So that's included. The BTP, it's included and it's called free credits, but even SAP says, hey, it's enough to basically work with it for a couple of months, try it out without having to pay anything. But if you use it productively, you're going to need more of those credits. And then BPI, which is, I think, really cool. We work as business process consultants with Signavio. It's a significant change, and it's also changing the way we look at business processes. So Signavio is really amazing. SAP Enable Now is not included, but what SAP does is they provide a lot of training materials that was built with Enable Now. I put it on there because it's something you should consider for your end user enablement, and maybe with the S4 conversion, that's an opportunity to look at your Enable Now and enablement strategy. So we work a lot with Enable Now. So with that, I think the next slide goes back to Andy, talking a bit more about the operations and what RISE with SAP is.
Absolutely. And so, really when we look at SAP RISE, there's a couple of different flavors of RISE. And, Bernd, certainly you can fill in some of your experience too. But overall, when we look at RISE, SAP RISE is ultimately a subscription service. SAP is going from the traditional model where you would buy on-premise licenses up front and pay maintenance. And so it turns that from a CapEx to more of an OpEx model. And so what they're able to do is provide you with the S4 HANA licenses at a significantly reduced cost. And doing that is more of an operational model where you don't have that large upfront investment. In addition to that, SAP takes on the hosting of the SAP RISE environment, the S4 environment, or your other components that would be on HANA or on other databases like SAP ASE. And so what we see is a couple of different flavors of the SAP RISE offering. And so when we look at that, on this slide, you can kind of see what those options begin to look like. So the first option being your traditional S4 on-premises, where you would buy the licenses, more of the traditional model. But then from there, we kind of move into the S4 RISE, where your S4 environment is put into the RISE for S4 cloud. There's also options for your other SAP environments, where those would go into what SAP calls PCE, or the Private Cloud Edition. And that allows you to run components that are maybe not S4 or BW4 HANA. So this could be like a CRM or an SRM system that's running on ASE database in the RISE PCE environment. And then finally, SAP also offers an infrastructure as a service environment where they give you kind of more of a traditional infrastructure service.
And maybe to expand on that, for all us existing SAP customers, what transpired over the last 12 months is really RISE with Cloud Private Edition is really the biggest chunk of projects we are seeing. There is a big potential for the public edition, but it all depends on what you do, how you want to configure it. But we see most of the existing SAP customers are going to RISE with SAP on the Private Cloud Edition because they can keep control of their customizations and third-party software to a certain extent. Sorry, Andy.
Nope, not at all. And then really, when we kind of look at the journey, moving to a RISE with SAP or even an S4 solution, you can see here just kind of a basic flow chart and kind of the landing zones for each of those solutions. So taking a look on the left side, for any existing SAP customers that might have an existing ECC landscape, whatever the version is, you can see that there are options where you can continue to run on ECC. And actually, we do see a number of customers that might choose to leave their ECC environment there and move that into the RISE PCE environment. And so that can be kind of what we would call a lift and shift migration into the cloud. But then there are options to go ahead and transform and move into S4. And so Bernd kind of touched on the Greenfield versus the Brownfield approach, where we might go ahead and transform and convert from ECC on any database onto an S4 HANA system in RISE. But then we can also look at, for our new customers, starting on the right, you might choose to do a Greenfield implementation, either as a new customer, just implementing S4 for the first time, or maybe for those existing customers that have an ECC landscape, they might choose to go ahead and set up a Greenfield environment, go live on S4 while still having their ECC environment as a legacy environment. And that kind of offers more of a soft cutover as they adopt those new functionalities of the S4 system. So now we'll turn it back over to Bernd, and we'll talk about what does it look like with the business process transformation. Bernd?
Great. So we're going to focus on the business process side, because at the end, SAP is all about the business processes. And again, I personally come from infrastructure, I come from the IT, but the business processes is driving everything that's below it. And I think as technology evolved, as infrastructure became, I hate to call it a commodity because it sounds cheap, it's much more than that, but it comes infrastructure as a service, the business processes take more and more center stage. But it doesn't mean that infrastructure goes away. I think it's even more important, but you have to look at it differently, and we appreciate the opportunity working with Andy and with Managecore, and us marrying those two. I think we are the only two companies doing that on the market, which is very unique. So if we go to the first slide of this section, it's a quote from Christian Klein. It's really about adapting business process quickly, and I think we shouldn't push out the conversion to S4HANA. We shouldn't push out going to RISE with SAP, because it's the future. All software is going to be subscription based in the future. So we should just go ahead and take advantage of the flexibility SAP is doing now, because they offer so many specials they're not going to offer 5 years from now. So we should all go full in. Next slide, please, Andy. So in order to get to RISE with S4, there are really two steps. We're going to get to S4 and we're going to get to RISE. Later, we're going to talk about an assessment, which we should do in the beginning, because we don't know where you are and you don't know exactly where you are. And you need to figure out where you want to go, why do you want to go there, and how to get there. And that's basically to do an assessment. The second step is then to do the actual conversion. And if you do that assessment formally or informally, you're going to do an assessment no matter what. And what we recommend, both Managecore and us, we developed this assessment package that we can look at both operations for RISE, operations in general, and then the S4 conversion path to get to S4HANA RISE. So on the next slide, what we do specifically, and this is only the functional assessment. So we are on ECC and we need to get to S4, and we need to get to RISE on S4. So the first step is we need to figure out what's the business case, what are the potentials, what are the benefits, and there are tools from SAP like the Value Lifecycle Manager, the Process Discovery. There's a TCO analysis specifically for RISE, so we need to figure out what are the potential and benefits. We look at the technical convertibility. So this is, do you have your business partners? Do you have your general ledger simplified and all the other things? What about custom code? And there are also tools for that. Running the tools, everybody can do that. But what you need to do is you need to know what the result of the tool actually means, and you need to bring experience with that. Influencing factors, that's everything that is around your SAP system, connections, interfaces, and so on. And then what are the adjustments you need to do prior to the S4 conversions? And there are projects you can do today, clean up your data, convert the business partners, and so on. And that gets you to the roadmap. After we develop the roadmap, we go to the next slide and we do the actual conversion. And when you do a conversion, I put it functional conversion, but really it's a technical conversion and a functional conversion. That's why Andy and I are here together. From our side, we have to do the conversion tasks. Some of the DMO, that's going to be all run by Andy's team, but we're going to look at the business process as the change management, program management, business processes, custom development, adjustment, and so on. So we typically do 2 mock conversions into the cloud. Then we do the production support systems, QoS and development, and then build our way up to the production system. We do 1 dress rehearsal, and then we put the production cut over, and then we call it ready for innovations, because the step to RISE and the step to S/4HANA. Getting there is only the first step in a journey to do much more with the environment, because now we have the potential and capability to do so. So what we do here at CNT is a lot of the program, process, and change management. And this is, again, unique to CNT. This is something you only usually get if you talk to, and I don't want to mention any names, but the big 4, 5, 6 consulting firms, which are always showing up with 200 consultants and millions of dollars of invoices. And it's not that we work for free, but we have a different approach working with customers. So at the very foundation, we are using SAP Activate for all our projects, for all our sub-projects. We augment the SAP Activate method with our best practices. We have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And this is especially critical in SAP RISE, because now we got 4 parties. We got the functional consulting firms, which would be us. We got the technical consulting firms, which is Andy and his team. We got you, and we got SAP, and we all have roles and responsibilities. And if we know, and if you know, and everybody knows, it's actually easy, but the biggest challenge is kind of lost in the middle items. We need clear objectives. We need to be clear on the data. We need to be very strong on the program, project, and change management. We like Enable now for user enablement. It's really cool. It's really neat. We need a good data migration strategy. We need to think about what data goes into the new environment, what data does not, or maybe all of it or none of it, TBD. And then we like Signavio. And the pinnacle for us is always the business process master list. So this is the first questions we usually ask in the project. How does your BPML look like? Do you have one? And how can we set up a base for your SAP system? On the next slide, there are different, this is the activity map from SAP for SAP RISE. We slightly adjusted it. So on the top, we have discover, prepare, explore, realize, deploy, and run, which are the SAP Activate phases, the phases of SAP Activate. And then the left-hand side, we have the different stages and areas of the project. So SAP really has 3 to 4 different areas which help us and help you building this initiative and this project. One is SAP Activate, the base method. Then there is an SAP Activate to get from ECC to S/4HANA. And there's a SAP Activate to get to SAP RISE. And then there is a framework. It's called an adoption framework, which I got this slide from and adjusted it slightly for getting to RISE with SAP. So this is an example, but it typically covers all. We need to think about the project management. We need to think about enablement. We need to design the application. We have extensions, integration, testing needs to be done, data, operations, and adoptions. And there's another one I didn't have the space, which is analytics at the very bottom. But there is a concrete workflow of what needs to happen, who is responsible. There are quality gates, which are the orange symbols on the screen, and who is doing what. On the next slide, this is the last topic from the functional perspective before we talk more operations. It's similar to the flow chart we saw earlier, just a bit simpler. We have either ECC, S/4HANA on-premise, or let's say you're already on GCP or something else, or you have non-SAP. You can go ECC to ECC on RISE. We prefer if you go straight to S/4HANA, if possible. If you're on ECC, you need to convert to S4 and migrate, and there are 5-ish different migration paths you can convert, then migrate. You can do everything in one. It could be too far to talk about that today. Or you can do a lift and shift. If you're in S4HANA already and made sure it's RISE conformed, we can just lift and shift the environment. And non-ERP, we can just migrate into RISE with SAP. Just quotation mark. With that, I give it back to Andy to talk about more technical aspects.
That's perfect. Thank you, Bernd. And I think that diagram does a really good job of setting the stage for what do those conversions look like, and what is the actual path that you follow. And so really where Managecore comes in and the way that we view our migrations, we follow the same SAP best practice project methodologies. And one of the things that's unique, the way that we go about our migrations, is with our CloudLink migration automation platform. And so just to talk about CloudLink for a minute, really what we've done at Managecore is taken SAP best practices, industry best practices, all of the years of experience of all the migrations that we've done, and we've baked that into this platform. And so what CloudLink allows us to do is to take out the risk of these migrations and deliver the migrations faster. So you say, how do we do that? One of the big things is automating and standardizing the common tasks that have to be done during the migration. So whether that's system builds, deploying network and cloud infrastructure, whether it's running the various SAP processes, CloudLink is able to take those steps and turn them into predictable, repeatable, and well-documented steps. And so with that, our CloudLink platforms allows us to rapidly migrate our customers to the cloud and continuing to offer our 100% success rate. And one of the big things that you see, we took a couple of examples of customers. A customer like Pegasystems, we can do a rapid migration. In this case, we migrated 30 SAP systems to the cloud in 9 weeks. And so maybe that's not every single migration. Certainly larger environments can take some more time, but our methodology at Managecore, we're able to do this very quickly. Now, to break that down a little bit more, in the bottom left, we can see just kind of some of the high level steps. But I think what I'd like to do is to just dive a little bit deeper and look at what does that project look like for a migration to the cloud. And so ultimately, the way that we approach this is to spend a lot of time up front in the planning, in the blueprinting phases. And during that time, it's all about discovery. It's about mapping what those requirements are and making sure that we know what are the requirements for this project. Once we've developed those requirements, done that planning, and some of the blueprinting, we start some of that implementation where we're laying down first the cloud foundation. And so whether this is in the native cloud or working with SAP, we're working on what does the connectivity look like from your on-premises site into the cloud? What are the configuration settings, the security settings, and what are the templates for these builds that we need? And then as we go through, we develop scripts, and then we move into the next phase where we're doing those initial migrations and conversions. So Bernd mentioned as we go in and do an S4 conversion, especially, there's a lot of code that's going to change. There's a lot of unknowns. And so in those first phases, we're actually taking a copy of production or a production-like system and using that for the initial migration into the cloud. And what that does is it allows us to figure out how long does the conversion take? What are the code remediation requirements? And what are the things that we need to consider as we move forward? And we take a lot of lessons learned from that initial implementation. So a lot of time is spent up front where we're able to develop those requirements, figure out what those things are. And then that allows us to build a runbook and then slowly iterate and gain up speed as we move downstream through the environment. And so whether it's a single sandbox run up front, or maybe doing 2 or 3 mocks up front, we're able to take those learnings and start to iterate very quickly. And what that does is all the while we're refining our scripts, refining our tool set, so that when we arrive at the production cutover weekend, we have a solid run book so that we're confident in the procedure, in the way that that migration is going to be delivered. But then we've also got a detailed project plan and cutover plan, which is detailed in many cases down to the minute. And that helps our consulting teams to know where they are in the migration process. But more so, it helps us to be transparent with our customer and give them full assurance. Here's where we are in the process. Here's any of the roadblocks that we're encountering. And here's when we anticipate the migration will complete. So that's a little bit around the migration. What I want to do is maybe just take a little bit of a step back and talk more specifically about the RISE solution. And so as we've discussed a little bit already, when we think about RISE, it's really kind of a shared responsibility model because you do have multiple parties that are involved. And so here what we've got is a high-level breakdown of what does a RISE solution really look like. And so at its foundation, is the underlying infrastructure, which in this case is provided by Google Cloud. Certainly, RISE can run on any of the three hyperscalers, whether it's Google, AWS, or Azure. From there, we've got the SAP solution. SAP actually has their own tenant on Google Cloud, which they're offering their RISE for SAP services through. And so within that RISE offering, SAP, as we discussed, is offering the software and the licensing. And then SAP is also handling the cloud and the application, kind of the core infrastructure administration of those SAP systems. And so for those technical folks, we're thinking about this as everything from client 000 and down. So what that means is the client 000 in the SAP system itself, the database, the operating system, and the infrastructure that SAP is handling. When we come in and look at a migration service, that can happen in a couple of different ways. So one of those is SAP services can perform that migration, or in many cases, they'll allow a partner like Managecore to come in and perform a lot of those migration steps. So Managecore can come in, we can do that migration in, and then SAP would ultimately ingest that system and have it in that RISE service offering. And then at the very top layer is really kind of the customer element of the equation. And so where the customer or a partner would come involved with these RISE for SAP solutions would first and foremost be the customer responsibilities in the model. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But then certainly there's also the support for any systems that are not necessarily in SAP RISE, and also making sure that some of the network connectivity to RISE is already in place. So we talk about RISE, and again, I mentioned it's kind of a shared responsibility model. And so one of the analogies that we like to use is to think about SAP RISE as a house. And so just like SAP RISE, when you buy a house, there is a little bit of an upfront cost maybe for the migration or to move into a house. But that house doesn't offer everything that you need in and of itself. So it's not turnkey. There's some maintenance that's required when you own a house. Let's think about things like cutting the lawn. Maybe you've got to fix the roof or hire a pest control service. Those things are left to you. And so in the RISE roles and responsibilities, what we see is anything that's happening in the default client of your SAP system is something that the customer ultimately is taking on, or something that they would have a partner take care of. And so there's actually more than 140 tasks that are in that matrix that customers have to plan on, both for the migration and also for the ongoing support of the system. And so in that case, that could be anywhere from transports and background jobs to implementing SAP notes. And certainly any of the project-based support and coordination of those SAP RISE services. So when we talk about moving into an operational model, one of the things that Managecore has done is we've created our Managecore IQ Plus solution. And so IQ Plus is a companion suite to the SAP RISE solution. It's meant for us to plug into SAP RISE and ultimately complement those services that are happening. And so going to that house analogy, it's kind of like hiring a lawn service, hiring a pest control service, hiring a painter, someone to put in a pool for you. Managecore is able to take care of all of those tasks. And ultimately what that allows is for your IT team to be freed up so that they can focus on something other than just keeping the lights on. We found that a lot of our customers, they've come back to us and told us that by having Managecore take care of that RISE support, their IT team now can do things that are more strategic and that are more innovative for the business. And so in the house example, it's kind of like you see the family off, they're off at the fair, they're having a great time. That's ultimately the same kind of a solution that we like to build in. And so for the managed services, Managecore can absolutely take care of that. But then certainly even in the course of the migration, Managecore is able to perform those migration services and will also serve as an interface between SAP RISE and you, the customer. And so we're able to coordinate that and make everything just a nice seamless transition. And ultimately, kind of the third iteration of this example is kind of the full picture, right? When we think about a house is going to be more valuable if it's in a community that has a good school, if it has a good hospital nearby, things like that. It's all of those services that go along with having a house. It's a whole community. And so in our example here, that's going to be all of the things that go to support your SAP landscape. And so one of the best practices is when we deploy our customers into SAP RISE on Google Cloud, one of the recommendations is actually to have a native Google Cloud tenant where you can deploy all of your network infrastructure, where you can do your VPNs and your interconnects. And then that same area is where you can host a lot of your other servers that may be SAP systems that just are not in the RISE solution. But that could also be things like a taxware, shipping software, anything that's interfacing with your SAP system. And that allows you to hold those systems in the Google Cloud, and we can actually set up an interconnect over to the RISE tenant and have those things be next to your SAP system with low latency. And so just to kind of finish off our analogy here, we see the picture. Our house now is in that community. It has everything that it needs. And that's ultimately what we advise for all of our customers moving into the SAP RISE environment is obviously think about your S4 transformation and your journey into RISE, but don't forget about all of those things that go along with SAP. And so one of the last things that I want to talk about here when we're deploying in RISE is ultimately what I touched on just before. And so in the picture here, we can see that inside of Google Cloud, we end up having two different entities. So one of those is off on the left, which is your SAP RISE tenant. And so that SAP RISE tenant is owned by SAP. And so as customers, we don't necessarily have access to that. But what's recommended is, again, on the right, to have your own projects within Google Cloud. And so, again, that's a great place to drop your VPN, your interconnect. That's where you can run your non-RISE SAP workloads. And then also, maybe taking all of the servers that would have been running in the cloud, you can put all of those right there. And so then everything is Google Cloud native networking. So you can do VPC peering between your cloud native project that's owned by your company and the SAP RISE tenant. And so that's really important because you can have all of your network connectivity extended into Google Cloud, and then it's just a simple VPC peering over to SAP RISE. And that allows everything to be a low latency connection. And it's really a great way to have any latency sensitive applications that are still very close to your S4 or your other SAP systems that are hosted into RISE. So now we took a look at the RISE solution, and we've talked a lot about Google Cloud, but I think one of the things to look at is, why do you put Google Cloud on SAP RISE? And so again, SAP RISE in itself is a really great solution. It's very cost effective, especially the way that they approach the licenses, and they provide a lot of that core infrastructure. But when we add in Google Cloud to the mix, that's where you really get the ultimate combination. And so the reason that RISE is best on Google Cloud is because Google is the best of the best in terms of the hyperscalers. Google has very agile and efficient infrastructure, and ultimately their technologies, things like live migration, allow those systems that are deployed inside of Google Cloud to be up even in the course of planned maintenance. Google also offers all of its customers some of the best technologies in terms of AI, machine learning, and analytics. And most recently, Google is doing a lot with their Cortex framework, which has the BigQuery extractor for SAP HANA. And that allows you to take your data out of S4, stream it into BigQuery, and then actually model your data right alongside of pre-provided data sets from Google Cloud. So you can overlay your own data sets inside of SAP with the Google's data sets, things like search trends, to really bring your data to life. Google also has some great features in terms of pricing. And of course, Google is the industry's cleanest cloud, which is really important in today's world. So obviously, SAP RISE is a great place Google Cloud is a great place to run your SAP RISE solution. But again, we talk about those non-SAP workloads, things that are going into a native cloud tenant. And again, that's where you can take even more of the best of Google. And so this slide shows just some of the many benefits of Google. I think the things to highlight here would be Google's private fiber network. Google has the largest network out of any of the clouds, and that allows you to connect locations around the globe on Google's low latency network. Google has very flexible pricing in terms of how they do their on-demand 1- and 3-year committed use discounts. And that allows you to be able to really scale your instances up and down based on demand and still take advantage of discounting up to 60%. And so, to that end, one of the other things that Managecore does when we move into the cloud is we help our customers to really understand what is the cost of running in the cloud, what is the cost on running in RISE, and how can we optimize those costs. And so certainly as part of the assessment that we do with CNT, we can offer a pricing estimation and just helping you to optimize what does your landscape need to look like, whether it's going into RISE or into Google Cloud. And so one of the big things is so often we see companies that will go in and say, we need to size for a 12 terabyte instance where, maybe right away they're not using all of that space. They don't need a system that's that big. With Google, what's great is we can factor in those systems and kind of look at tiering those with the commitment model. And so at year 1, we can go ahead and start them with a small, maybe a 3 terabyte instance and lock that in at the 3-year discounted rate. But then in year 2, maybe there's some growth. We can go ahead and tier on additional space to their HANA database. And then at that point, we can actually do discounts on that net additional resources or storage that's going on that HANA system. And so what we see is kind of a stair step in this case. And so what you're left is in that blue box over the 3-year period, compared to having done a 12 terabyte database right up front, all of that now is savings that you would have been spending otherwise. So cost optimization is really a big thing that Managecore can help out with when we're going into Google Cloud. And so as part of the assessment, that's something that we can take a look at and help you to build a business case around what are you spending today on premises and with your current systems, and then what is that spend going to look like once we move into the Google Cloud. So before we get into the assessment, I think I just want to take a moment to look at kind of a real world example. In this case, GCP Applied Technologies is a customer that moved into the SAP RISE environment. And so GCP AT, you may know them. They sell a lot of chemicals and materials used in construction, as well as in packaging. And so GCP Applied Technologies found themselves in a place where they needed to get out of a data center quickly with as little cost as possible. And obviously, they had a very low tolerance for any risk in that process. They do have a very complex SAP landscape, and they've got a lot of different technologies that are in use. And so what Managecore did is that we were able to look at their SAP environment, get all of their core SAP systems moved into S4 RISE, and then at the same time, we helped them decommission that same data center by moving over 150 different workloads into a Google native solution. As part of that, we also helped them to refactor their network in terms of security and implementing SD-WAN. And so at the end of the day, Managecore was able to take on the managed services for the environment and perform that migration, which ultimately got them the reduced cost of decommissioning the data center. But then we also were able to take care of the transformative opportunities within Google Cloud. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bernd to talk about the assessment.
Great. And thanks, Andy. And we have another probably 10 minutes. So this is a good time if you have any questions so far to put them into the Q&A box, and then we can address them when we're done talking about the assessment. So we mentioned the assessment. So what are the benefits of doing a formal assessment? So the first thing we need to do, and what's often missing, is creating a positive momentum for both S/4HANA and for SAP RISE. There are a lot of concerns, there are a lot of question marks, there are a lot of issues people think they have and they don't know. There's a lot of question marks. And first is we get the organization on board and get everybody a part of this process. So let's have them have the stakeholders participate in the assessment. We want to get the stakeholders, spend some time and dedication and focus on the conversion to see where are we, where do we need to go, and also get their buy-in. There are a lot of unknowns in the projects which we need to figure out. You don't know, we don't know. We know a lot how other customers did it, but we don't know how you're going to do it yet. That's why we do the assessment together. And then we need to understand what's the project going to look like, what's the scope, what's the conversion strategy, and then have basically a roadmap. And in the next slide, we're going to see what that roadmap would entail. So there are potentially, and we can summarize that into 3 parts, but if we really break it down area by area, there is a business case assessment. Now, in this kind of an assessment, you can have a 1-year assessment of building a business case. It's kind of a quick business case with the highlights. What are we doing? What are we trying to do? It's not focused on the business case alone, but it needs to be something that is covered because we need to answer to the business. What are we doing and why are we doing it? The functional assessment, I mentioned it earlier. The technical assessment, and you heard everything from Andy. They know how to do it, how to approach it. So there are a lot of things they already know, you might not know. We need to look at operations. That's also something Managecore is going to look at. What you're currently doing, what should you do, what do you need to do in the future? Then we need to think about what is our conversion strategy. Brownfield, Greenfield, is it some kind of a hybrid? And one of our strategies, especially if customers have an SAP system that works for them, that works well, is maybe we do a technical conversion and then do the innovation projects afterwards. It's one of our mantras to say don't mix conversion and innovation for those customers who are ready and have the environment for it. And then at the end, we build a roadmap together. And in the next slide, we have a bit of an example of how that assessment looks like. It's typically a 4-week assessment if we get everybody, all the stakeholders in this time frame. Otherwise, we maybe add 2 more weeks or do a little bit more remote. There's a discovery, there's a preparation week, and then there's a core on-site week where we really talk face-to-face with the stakeholders, both on the operations side and on the business sides. And then we have the assessment week where we put together the information, get more information, and then we present the written roadmap together. And then you can take it and hopefully work with us, work with CNT and work with Managecore. But at the same time, you can say, I also take this to vendor XYZ. Hopefully not. So the outcome is a written conversion roadmap. If you don't do it formally with us, you can also do it yourself. I encourage everybody to take advantage of all the know-how we have and Andy's team have. It's the functional technical scope, it's the operational conversion cost budget, and it's the written guides which you can then use in the project. So with that, we come to the end of the presentation and to the Q&A session. So please, again, use the Q&A feature. And let me check. I don't see the question window right now. Here it is. So one of the question, and I would like to have Andy talk about that. Customer says, we are on ECC EHP 6. Should we upgrade to EHP 8 before migrating to S/4HANA?
That's a very good question. And actually something that we see quite often is customers trying to figure out, I'm not ready to go to HANA yet because I need to first upgrade to Enhancement Package 7 or Enhancement Package 8. And really what we see is, in most cases, an upgrade before your conversion to S4 is not necessary. Now, that said, really what it comes down to, and where I would put the typical "it depends" answer on, is trying to figure out how much change does your company want to tolerate at a single go. A lot of customers that we see don't have the tolerance or the ability to do incremental upgrades or to do upgrades every single year. And so in many cases, the transformation to S4 is one of the few shots that they have. And so in those cases, I would say stay on ECC 6 Enhancement Package 6 and go and upgrade and migrate directly to S4. Now, that said, if you're on an older release, in some cases, it does make sense to do kind of an initial upgrade. And what that does is to reduce the amount of change that you're applying to the landscape at a given time. And so if you've got a lot of transformations in your system, you want to minimize the amount of work that you're having to do to remediate that code. You could do it in 2 separate steps, but again, that will definitely extend the duration of the project. So in many cases, it's not necessary to upgrade to Enhancement Pack 8 first, but that's where I think the assessment would be a really good value, where we can actually get in, we can take a look at that, and then we can help you look at what are your options and what are the pros and cons of doing the 2-step upgrade versus going straight to S4.
Okay. The next question I also give back to you, operations. How does SAP RISE handle our printers and print servers when moving to S4 into RISE?
Yeah, another good one. So in the SAP RISE world, obviously you'll have S4 in the SAP RISE tenant. And as part of the RISE solution, SAP RISE does offer you kind of a file share server that can sit out there. However, you don't have full access to the operating system and controls over that. So because of that, there are a number of cases where we advise our customers to go ahead and stand up a tenant within the cloud. And so we talked about that during the presentation, but ultimately what we're looking at is you may want to move a print server, an FTP server into a native Google Cloud tenant and peer that with your S4 tenant. And so in the case of printers and print servers, having a print server centrally in the cloud allows you to be able to print directly to that server. And we've had customers successfully host printers around the globe off of centralized print servers that are up in the cloud. So definitely something where I would advise, having a centralized print server, but there is also opportunity to leave your existing print infrastructure in place. But again, that can be a little bit more complex in nature, but something that certainly we would advise and look at during the migration cycle.
The next question, and I'm going to take this on, is the private deployment is more focused towards conversion and not Greenfield. It's also a good question that it comes to the overall confusion we all have about SAP RISE. So if you want to do a conversion, you probably have to do, you have to do Brownfield. You can't do a Greenfield conversion. That would be a transformation. Having said that, the public and the private RISE option is really 2 operating models. Either the public cloud means SAP manages everything, including everything up, and you have limited options to customize. And it's basically, I shouldn't say that, but it's the SAP version of Salesforce. Sorry. But the private cloud, you can do a Greenfield private cloud implementation. But I think if you do Greenfield, you should go with the public cloud, because I think 5, 10, 15 years from now, after everybody's on RISE private, we're going to start moving everybody to the public cloud as well, because that is the next step in the evolution. So you probably should consider a public cloud if you do Greenfield. The next question is, do people generally use Fiori apps when converting to S/4HANA? So that's, again, independent from RISE. I can also take up this question. When we see conversion, it depends on what you do, and it depends on your appetite for change. We have customers, they do a technical conversion to S/4HANA, and they didn't change and implement any single Fiori app unless they have to, because nothing else is available. So we have customers operating on S/4HANA completely with the old interface. We have other customers, they go all in. I guess it all depends on your appetite for change. It should also be depending on which customer or which user is doing what. because some users might benefit from the new interface. Some users need the old interface because there are some things that are so special that the only way you can get there is using the old interface. The next question, and I think this is the last question so far, unless anything else comes in. How do customers adapt to S/4HANA simplified model from ABAP tech specs or functional specs due to the new structure and table? How to manage these risks? So the starting point here would be the custom code check, which is a standard check we do in the assessment. And if you have custom code is a whole different topic. If you have like a little bit custom code, depending on how you define a little bit, you can just remediate yourself. But if you have a lot of custom codes, you might want to look at tools that help you with the custom code remediation. When it comes to the general ledger, just a simplified model, these are projects we do ahead of the conversion. So do the new GL, do the business partner conversions, we call them pre-projects, is something we should do ahead of the conversion and not during the conversion. Preferably. And overall custom code, a lot of the approaches and the strategy for risk mitigation is to have a stringent test approach that we really define what is it, how does it work, how is it going to work with S/4HANA, and simulate and test the process. Good. Maybe there's one more question that came in, Andy, for you.
Yep.
I don't know if you can see it. Can we have the highest SLAs like 99.9% with RISE with SAP and GCP, or are there any limitations with SLAs?
Yeah, it's also a good question. So there's a couple of answers to that. And so I'll start with from just the GCP perspective, and then we can talk a little bit about RISE. So in Google Cloud itself, Google Cloud does offer a 99.9% single instance SLA. So that would mean that the infrastructure itself for a single server, that server would technically have that 3 nines of availability. And then in Google Cloud, what they allow you to do is if you implement a cluster, so whether that's an NQ replication server or doing like a HANA HAE cluster, for your database, you can bring that up to 4 nines, where you would do 99.99% uptime. Now, that is, of course, from the infrastructure levels and what Google is offering. So once you're in the SAP RISE umbrella, that's up to SAP. And so that's something where in the contract with SAP RISE, you can factor in whether you want to have a DR system or HA. In terms of the specific SLAs, I don't want to go into those specifics just because they can vary a little bit from contract to contract. But I have definitely seen some of the higher SLAs, but maybe not quite as high as a 4 nines of availability that you would see otherwise.
Great. That's all questions for now.
Looks like we have just one more here.
Okay, let's do one more then. Oh yeah, I just see it. With S/4HANA RISE with SAP Private Cloud, do you see all the customers going to conversions or even go for Greenfield? I think it mirrors what I mentioned earlier. You can do Greenfield in the private cloud. I guess it really depends on what you want to do. Some of the things, how to phrase that, but is to set your expectations for the public cloud. It's a great solution, but you can't do everything you do in the private cloud. And it depends on what you want to do. So if you want to have all the flexibility, you might better off doing the private cloud. If you have a fairly standardized environment, you might be much better off with the public cloud. I guess it depends, and we can look at the specific circumstance. But I guess with that, we are right at 12 o'clock, 1 more minute. Next steps, we're going to send out the presentation for today. I'm going to include Andy's and my contact information. We're going to reach out individually, or you can reach out to us if you're interested specifically in the assessment, or also just would like to have more information. No obligation assessment discussion with us anytime. Andy and I are available. Also our functional consultants and operational consultants from Andy's team. So with that, we appreciate your participation today. I appreciate Andy, you joining me. And with that, we're going to go ahead, close the call. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.